24 Writing, political evil, and linguistic evil. Desire desires the exteriority of presence and non-presence. This exteriority is a matrix. Among all its representations, exteriority of nature and its others, of good and of evil, of innocence and perversity, of consciousness and non-consciousness, of life and death, etc., one in particular requires our special notice. It will introduce us to the essay on the origin of languages. It is the exteriority of mastery and servitude, or of liberty and non-liberty. Among all these representations, the exteriority of liberty and non-liberty is perhaps privileged. More clearly than others, it brings together the historical, political, economic, technological, and the metaphysical. Heidegger has summarized the history of metaphysics by repeating that which made of liberty the condition of presence, that is to say, of truth. Point 2. And speech always presents itself as the best expression of liberty. It is by itself language at liberty, and the liberty of language, the freedom of a speech which need not borrow its signifiers from the exteriority of the world, and which therefore seems incapable of being dispossessed. Do the most imprisoned and deprived beings not make use of that interior spontaneity which is speech? What is true of the citizen is in the first place true of those naked beings exposed to the power of others, the newborn. Your first gifts are fetters, your first treatment, torture. Their voice alone is free, why should they not raise it in complaint? Emile, p. 15 poll, italics added. The essay on the origin of languages opposes speech to writing as presence to absence and liberty to servitude. These are almost the final words of the essay, but I say that any tongue with which one cannot make oneself understood to the people assembled is a slavish tongue. It is impossible for a people to remain free and speak that tongue, chap XX. With this sentence, through the Dider of the Levi-Straussian ideology of the neighborhood, of a small community where everybody knew everybody else and where nobody went beyond earshot, we have set foot again upon a Rousseauist ground that we had hardly left, a classical ideology according to which writing takes the status of a tragic fatality come to prey upon natural innocence, interrupting the golden age of the present and full speech. Rousseau concludes thus: these superficial reflections, which hopefully might give birth to more profound ones, I shall conclude with the passage that suggested them to me, to observe in fact and to show by examples, the degree to which the character, customs, and interests of a people influence their language, would provide material for a sufficiently philosophical investigation. Remarks on a General and Reasoned Grammar, by M. Duclos, p2 pp 73-74. In fact, the commentary 3 of Duclos, with the essay Sur l'origine de connaissances humaines * of Condillac, 1746, seems to have been one of the major sources of the essay on the origin of languages. One might even be tempted to consider Rousseau's essay as the accomplishment of the philosophic program charted by Duclos. The latter regrets the penchant we have of making our language soft, effeminate, and monotonous. We have reason to avoid roughness in pronunciation, but I think we go too far into the opposite fault. Formerly we pronounced many more diphthongs than we do today, in the tenses, as j avoy havwe, j oros irwe, and in many nouns, such as fran ois franswe, angloy angleway, polonois polonwe, whereas today we say j avise have, franza, angli, polone. Those diphthongs, however, gave force and variety to pronunciation, and saved it from a monotony that partly arises from our multitude of mute es. Point 4. The degradation of the language is the symptom of a social and political degradation, a theme that will become most frequent in the second half of the 18th century. It has its origins in the aristocracy and in the capital city. Duclos announces the Rousseauist themes most precisely when he holds forth thus: what we call society, and what our ancestors would merely have called a coterie, decides the nature of language and manners moors today. When a word has been for a time in use in these social circles, its pronunciation softens. 5. Duclos finds equally intolerable similar mutilations inflicted upon words, their corruptions, and above all their abridgments. One must on no account shorten coeur words. This nonchalance in pronunciation, which is not incompatible with an impatience in expression, makes us corrupt even the nature of words, by chopping them up in such a way that the meaning is no longer recognizable. Today, for example, one pronounces the proverb as, in spite of him and his teeth ses dens, rather than in spite of him and his helpers ses aidens. We have more of these words shortened or corrupted by usage than one would credit. Our language will become imperceptibly more proper for conversations than for the tribune, and conversation sets the tone for the chair, the bar, and for the theater, whereas with the Greeks and Romans, the tribune did not submit to it. A sustained pronunciation and a fixed and distinct prosody must be maintained in particular by peoples who are obliged to treat publicly matters that are of interest to all the auditors, for, other things being equal, an orator whose pronunciation is firm and varied would be understood at a greater distance than another. Deterioration in the language and in pronunciation is thus inseparable from political corruption. The political model that inspires Duclos is Athenian 8. Our Roman democracy. The language is the property of the people. Each derives its unity from the other. For if language has a body and a system, they inhere in the people assembled and bodily united. It is a people in a body that makes a language. A people is thus the absolute master of the spoken language, and it is an empire they possess unawares. 6. To dispossess the people of their mastery of the language and thus of their self-mastery, one must suspend the spoken element in language. Writing is the very process of the dispersal of peoples unified as bodies and the beginning of their enslavement. The body of a nation alone has authority over the spoken language, and the writers have the right over the written language. The people, Varro said, are not masters of writing as they are of speech. p. 420. This unity of political and linguistic evil calls for a philosophical examination. Rousseau already responds to this appeal by means of the essay. But we shall, very much later, recognize Duclos' problematics in a much sharper form. The difficulty of the pedagogy of language and of the teaching of foreign languages is, Emile will say, that one cannot separate the signifier from the signified, and, changing words, one changes ideas in such a way that the teaching of a language transmits at the same time an entire national culture over which the pedagogue has no control, which resists him like the already there preceding the formation, the institution preceding instruction. You will be surprised to find that I reckon the study of languages among the useless lumber of education. If the study of languages were merely the study of words, that is, of the symbols by which language expresses itself, then this might be a suitable study for children, but languages, as they change the symbols, also modify the ideas which the symbols express. Minds are formed by language, thoughts take their color from its ideas. Reason alone is common to all. Every language has its own form, a difference which may be partly cause and partly effect of difference in national character. This conjecture appears to be confirmed by the fact that in every nation under the sun speech follows the changes of manners, and is preserved or altered along with them, p. 105 p. 73, and this entire theory of the teaching of languages rests on rigorous distinction separating thing, meaning, or idea, and sign. Today we would speak of it. Referent, the signified, and the signifier. If the representer may have an effect, sometimes pernicious, on the represented, and if the child must not and cannot learn to speak more than one language, it is that each thing may have 1,000 different signs for him, but each idea may have only one form, if it. Launched by Duclos, the invitation to the philosophic examination occupied Rousseau for a long time. In 1754 it had been formulated in the commentary. It is cited at the conclusion of the essay. Elsewhere other passages of the commentary are evoked, notably in chapter 7. Do these citations, which could not have been anterior to the publication of the second discourse, Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men, also dated 1754, lead us to some certainty about the date of the composition of the essay? And to what extent can one connect this chronological problem with the systematic problem of what is called the author's thought? The importance that we assign to this work compels us to consider the question. On the date of the composition of this little-known and posthumously published text, the most authoritative interpreters and historians rarely agree. And when they do, it is generally for different reasons. The ultimate question at stake within this problem is evident. Can one speak of this as a work of maturity? Does its content accord with the second discourse and the latter works? In this debate, external arguments always mingle with internal ones. The debate has continued for more than 70 years and has gone through two phases. If we begin by remembering the most recent, it is primarily because it has developed a little as if the first phase had not brought the external aspect of the problem to what I would consider to be a definite conclusion. But it is also because, in a certain way, it has renewed the form of the internal problem. The present debate, the economy of pity. The passages cited from Duclos are not the sole indications that allow modern commentators to conclude that the essay comes after the second discourse or that it is at the most its contemporary. B. Gagnovan and M. Raymond recall in their edition of the Confession 7 that the essay on the origin of languages appeared for the first time in a volume of treatises on music by J.J. Rousseau, which de Perrault published in Geneva in 178-1, based on the manuscript which he possessed and which he bequeathed to the Library of Neuchâtel, number 7835. The editors of the Confessions draw attention to this most remarkable little work, too little read, and use the citations from Duclos as evidence for placing it after the second discourse. In short, they add, the very material of the essay presupposes a knowledge and a maturity of thought that Rousseau had not acquired in 1750. This is also the opinion of R. Derrida, 8 at least on chapter 9 and X, which are among the most important and which, explaining the formation of the languages of the South and the formation of the languages of the North, develop the themes most akin to those of the second discourse. Is it not plausible and tempting to imagine that Rousseau might have spread out the composition of this text over many years? Can one not isolate in it many strata of his reflections? Could the passages from Duclos not have been introduced later? Could certain of the important chapters not have been composed, completed, or revised at the same time as the second discourse or even after? That would reconcile the interpretations and would give a certain authority to the hypothesis of those who now place the conception, if not the entire execution, of the essay well before. Thus Vaughan thinks, for external reasons, that the essay was planned before the second discourse, and even before the first discourse, 1750. Indeed, it relates very closely to the writings on music. Its full title says it well, Essay on the Origin of Languages, which treats of melody and musical imitation. It is known that the writings on music follow from a very precocious inspiration. In 1742 Rousseau read at the Academy of Sciences his Projet concernant les nouveaux signes pour la musique. In 1743 the dissertation sur la musique moderne appeared. In 1749, year of the composition of the first discourse, Rousseau wrote, at D'Alembert's behest, the articles on music for the encyclopedia. It is in the context of these articles that he will write the Dictionnaire de musique * to which the essay was joined at the time of its first publication. Can one not imagine that the essay was projected at this time, even if its execution stretched out over many years, Rousseau modifying till 1754 certain intentions and certain chapters until he thought to make of the essay, as he says in a preface, LQ a piece of the second discourse? However, in spite of the convenience and plausibility of this reconciling conjecture, there is one point at which, for internal and systematic reasons, it is difficult to get rid of the disagreement by assigning a period and a part of the truth to each hypothesis. Here one must choose sides. The moment comes with respect to the philosophical content of chapter 9, Formation of the Southern Languages. It is over the subject of this fundamental chapter that de Raaff and Stravinsky differ. To be sure, they are never directly opposed on this point. But both give a note H to it, and their confrontation may illuminate our problem. That the essay was an intended part of the second discourse is, according to de Raaff, the most plausible hypothesis, at least with respect to chapters 9 and X, which show the same preoccupations as the discourse on inequality. Now, it is precisely in chapter 9 that Stravinsky locates an affirmation which seems incompatible to him with the intention of the second discourse. From it he concludes that Rousseau's thought had evolved. And it could only have evolved from the essay to the discourse, since the doctrine will seemingly no longer vary on this point after 175 plus thus, systematically, and historically, the essay is anterior to the second discourse. And that would appear from an examination of the status given by him to that fundamental sentiment which according to him is pity. Briefly, the discourse makes of it a natural feeling or virtue, coming before the use of reflection, while in the essay, Rousseau seems to think that it is previously aroused ab imagite us conserve all the indeterminacy of the word for the moment by judgment. Since it gives rise to no disagreement, let us first recall the doctrine of the discourse. Rousseau affirms there unambiguously that pity is more primitive than the work of reason and reflection. That is a condition of its universality. And the argument could not help but aim at Hobbes. I think I need not fear contradiction in holding man to be possessed of the only natural virtue, which could not be denied him by the most violent detractor of human virtue. Point 12 I am speaking of compassion pity, which is a disposition suitable to creatures so weak and subject to so many evils as we certainly are, bys so much the more universal and useful to mankind, as it comes before any kind of reflection, and at the same time so natural, that the very brutes themselves sometimes give evident proofs of it. And after giving examples of it within the human and the animal order, but referring almost always to the mother-child relationship, Rousseau continues, such is the pure emotion of nature, prior to all kinds of reflection. Such is the force of natural compassion la pitié naturelle, which the greatest depravity of morals has as yet hardly been able to destroy. Mandeville well knew that, in spite of all their morality, men would have never been better than monsters, had not nature bestowed on them a sense of compassion pity, to aid their reason. It is then certain that compassion pity is a natural feeling, which, by moderating the violence of love of self in each individual, contributes to the preservation of the whole species. It is this compassion pity that hurries us without reflection to the relief of those who are in distress. It is this which in a state of nature supplies the place of laws, morals, and virtues, with the advantage that none are tempted to disobey its gentle voice. pp 183-84.13. Let us pause before we take up the thread of the debate. Let us reconsider the system of metaphors. Natural pity, which is illustrated archetypically by the relationship between mother and child, and generally by the relationship between life and death, commands like a gentle voice. In the metaphor of that soft voice the presence of the mother as well as of nature is at once brought in. That the soft voice must be the mother's as well as nature's is clear from the fact that it is, as the metaphor of the voice clearly always indicates in Rousseau, a law. No one is tempted to disobey it at the same time because it is soft and because, being natural, and absolutely original, it is also inexorable. That maternal law is a voice. Pity is a voice. As opposed to writing, which is without pity, the voice is always, in its essence, the passage of virtue and good passion. The order of pity takes the place of law, it supplements law, that is to say instituted law. But as institutional law is also the supplement of natural law when the latter is lacking, it is clear that only the concept of the supplement allows us to think the relationship between nature and law here. These two terms have no meaning except within the structure of supplement to writing. The authority of non-maternal law has no sense except as it is substituted for the authority of natural law, for the gentle voice which it was clearly necessary to be tempted to disobey. The order without pity to which one accedes when the gentle voice stops making itself heard, is it quite simply, as we let it be imagined a moment ago, the order of writing? Yes and no. Yes, to the extent that writing is read literally, or is tied to the letter on literature la letra, ou on la la letra. No, as long as writing is understood in its metaphor. One might then say that the natural law, the gentle voice of pity, is not only uttered by a maternal solicitude, it is inscribed in our hearts by God. It concerns the natural writing, the writing of the heart, which Rousseau opposes to the writing of reason. Only the latter is without pity, it alone transgresses the interdict that, under the name of natural affection, links the child to the mother and protects life from death. To transgress the law and the voice of pity is to replace natural affection by perverse passion. The first is good because it is inscribed in our hearts by God. It is here that we encounter that divine or natural writing whose metaphoric displacement we have already situated. In Emile, describing what he calls the second birth, Rousseau will write, "Our passions are the chief means of self-preservation, to try to destroy them is therefore as absurd as it is useless, this would be to overcome nature, to reshape God's handiwork. If God bade man annihilate the passions he has given him, he would and would not do so, he would contradict himself. He has never given such a foolish commandment, there is nothing like it written on the heart of man, and what God will have a man do, he does not leave to the words of another man, he speaks himself, his words are written in the secret heart," pages 246-47, p. 0173. The absolutely primitive passion, which God may not ask us to deny without contradicting himself, is the love of self, one amour de soi. It is well known that Rousseau distinguishes it from that self-love l'amour propre which is its corrupt form. Now, if the source of all passions is natural, all the passions are not so. 8,000 strange channels have swollen it, if it. What concerns us here about the status of pity, the root of the love of others, is that it is neither the source itself, nor a secondary stream of passion, one acquired passion among others. It is the first diversion of the love of self. It is almost primitive, and it is in the difference between absolute proximity and absolute identity that all the problematics of pity are lodged. The child's first sentiment is love of self, one amour de soi, and his second, which is derived from it, is love of those about him, p. 248, p. 0174. That diversion/derivation is next demonstrated, it is less an estrangement and an interruption of the love of self than its first and most necessary consequence. If pity moderates the violence one activite of love of self, second discourse, p. 156, po 184, it is perhaps less by opposing itself to it than by expressing it in an indirect way, by deferring it, since such moderation contributes to the preservation of the whole species, ibid. It must further be understood how and why pity, itself supplanted by law and society, may also play the role of that which supplants. Why at a given time or all the time does it take the place of culture, being that which in a state of nature supplies the place of laws, morals, and virtues? Discourse, p. 184. Against what analog of itself, against what depravity does it guard us, which resembles and yet differs from it enough so that a substitution may take place? Is it by chance that, like many another supplement, the natural and pre-reflexive sentiment of pity, which contributes to the preservation of the whole species, protects us from, among other deadly menaces, love? Is it by chance that pity protects man, homo, from destruction through the fury of love, to the extent that it protects man, vir, from his destruction through the fury of woman? What God's inscription means is that pity which ties the child to the mother and life to nature must protect us from the amorous passion which ties the child's becoming man, the second birth, to the mother's becoming woman. That becoming is the great substitution. Pity protects the humanity of man, and the life of the living, to the extent that it saves, as we shall go on to see, the virility of man and the masculinity of the male. In fact, if pity is natural, if that which brings us to identify with others is an innate movement, love, or the amorous passion is, on the contrary, not natural at all. It is a product of history and society. Of the passions that stir the heart of man, there is one which makes the sexes necessary to each other, and is extremely ardent and impetuous, a terrible passion that braves danger, surmounts all obstacles, and in its transport seems calculated to bring destruction on the human race which it is really destined to preserve. What must become of men who are left to this brutal and boundless rage, without modesty, without shame, and daily upholding their amours at the price of their blood? Discourse, p. 157, p. 185. Under this bloody picture one must read, as in a palimpsest, the other scene, that which, a moment ago and in the same colors, exhibited a world of dead horses, ferocious animals, and children torn from the mother's breast. The amorous passion is thus the perversion of natural pity. Unlike the latter, it limits our attachment to a single person. As always in Rousseau, evil here has the form of determination, of comparison, and of preference. That is to say, of difference. This invention of culture denatures pity, deflects its spontaneous movement, which would carry it instinctively and indistinctly toward everything living, whatever may be its species and sex. Jealousy, which marks the gap between pity and love, is not only a creation of culture in our society. As a ruse of comparison, it is a stratagem of femininity, an arresting of nature by woman. What is cultural and historical in love is at the service of femininity, made to enslave man to woman. It is a factitious sentiment, born of social usage, supersubtly celebrated by women, with care for the establishment of their empire, and rendering dominant the sex that ought to obey, p. 158. Emile will say that the law of nature bids the woman obey the man, p. 517, po 370. And Rousseau describes here the battle between man and woman according to the pattern and in the very terms of the Hegelian dialectic of master and slave, which illuminates not only his text but also the phenomenology of the mind. If he takes a wife from a lower class, natural and civil law are in accordance and all goes well. When he marries a woman of higher rank it is just the opposite case, the man must choose between diminished rights or imperfect gratitude, he must be ungrateful or despised. Then the wife, laying claim to authority, makes herself a tyrant over her lawful head, and the master, who has become a slave, is the most ridiculous and miserable of creatures. Such are the unhappy favorites whom the sovereigns of Asia honor and torment with their alliance. People tell us that if they desire to sleep with their wife they must enter by the foot of the bed, ibid. The historical perversion 15 is introduced through a double substitution of a political command for domestic government, and of moral for physical love. It is natural that the woman govern the home, and Rousseau recognizes her natural talent for it, but she must do it under the husband's authority, as a minister reigns in the state, by contriving to be ordered to do what she wants. I expect that many of my readers will remember that I think women have a natural gift for managing men, and will accuse me of contradicting myself, yet they are mistaken. There is a vast difference between claiming the right to command, and managing him who commands. Women's reign is a reign of gentleness, tact, and kindness. Her commands are caresses, her threats are tears. She should reign in the home as a minister reigns in the state, by contriving to be ordered to do what she wants. In this sense, I grant you, that the best managed homes are those where the wife has most power. But when she despises the voice of her head, when she desires to usurp his rights and take the command upon herself, this inversion of the proper order of things leads only to misery, scandal, and dishonor. Ibid. Italics added. In modern society, then, order has been reversed by woman, and that is the very form of usurpation. That substitution is not one of use among others. It is the paradigm of violence and political anomaly. Like the linguistic evil of which we spoke above, and we shall soon see the two directly linked, that substitution is a political evil. The letter to M. D. Alembert says it well, and, no longer wishing to tolerate separation, unable to make themselves into men, the women make us into women. This disadvantageous result which degrades man is very important everywhere, but it is especially so in states like ours, whose interest it is to prevent it. Whether a monarch governs men or women ought to be rather indifferent to him, provided that he be obeyed, but in a republic, men are needed. The morality of this proposition is that women themselves would gain if the republic restored the natural order, for in a perverse society man scorns the woman he must obey, cowardly devoted to the will of the sex that we ought to protect rather than serve. We have learned to scorn them while we obey, to outrage them by our railing concern. And Paris, guilty of the degradations of language, is again incriminated, and each Parisian woman in her apartment assembles a seraglio of men more feminine than herself, who know how to render all kinds of homage to beauty, except for that of the heart which she deserves. Ibid. The natural image of woman, as Rousseau reconstitutes it, emerges slowly, exalted by man but submissive to him. She must govern without being mistress. One must respect her, that is to say love her, from a sufficient distance so that the forces our own and those of the body politic are not breached through it. For we risk our constitution not only by cohabiting with women, instead of containing them within domestic governmenti, but also by regulating our society according to theirs. They men are affected as much as and more than women by commerce that is too intimate. They lose only their morals, but we lose our morals and our constitution. P. 204, Po 100J. The contest is not equal, perhaps that is the most profound signification of the play of supplementary writing. This takes us directly to the other form of substitutive perversion, THAT, which adds moral to physical love. There is a naturalness in love, it serves procreation and the conservation of the species. That which Rousseau calls the physicalness of love is, as its name indicates, natural, and thus joined to the movement of pity. Desire is not pity, to be sure, but, according to Rousseau, it is pre-reflexive like pity. Now one must distinguish between what is moral and what is physical in the passion called love. Second Discourse, p. 157, po. 196j. Within the moral that substitutes itself for the natural, within the institution, history, and culture, female perfidy, thanks to social usage, works to arrest natural desire in order to capture its energy so that it may be directed to a single person. It thus makes sure of an usurping of control. The physical part of love is that general desire which urges the sexes to union with each other. The moral part is that which determines and fixes this desire exclusively upon one particular object, or at least gives it a greater degree of energy toward the object thus preferred. Discourse, pp. 157-58, po. 186. The operation of femininity, and that femininity, the feminine principle, may be at work among women just as much as among those whom society calls men, and whom, Rousseau says, women turn to women, consists therefore in capturing energy to attach it to a single theme, a sole representation. Such is the history of love. In it is reflected nothing but history as denaturalization, that which adds itself to nature. The moral supplement displaces the force of nature by substitution. In that sense the supplement is nothing, it has no energy of its own, no spontaneous movement. It is a parasitic organism, an imagination or representation which determines and orients the force of desire. One can never explain, in terms of nature and natural force, the fact that something like the difference of a preference might, without any force of its own, force. Such an inexplicability gives all its style and all its form to Rousseau's thought. This pattern is already an interpretation of history by Rousseau. But this interpretation lends itself in its turn to a second interpretation where we notice a certain hesitation. Rousseau seems to oscillate between two readings of this history. And the sense of that oscillation should be recognized here. It will illuminate our analysis yet further. Sometimes the perverse substitution is described as the origin of history, as historicity itself and the first deviation with respect to natural desire. Sometimes it is described as an historical depravity within history, not just a corruption within the form of supplementarity but a supplementary corruption. It is thus that one may read descriptions of an historical society within which woman takes her place, remains in her place, occupies her natural place, as an object of uncorrupted love. The ancients spent almost their whole lives in the open air, either dispatching their business or taking care of the states in the public place, or walking in the country, in gardens, on the seashore, in the rain or under the sun, and almost always bareheaded. In all of this, no women, but they were quite able to find them in case of need, and we do not find from their writings and the samples of their conversation which are left to us that intelligence, taste, or even love, lost anything by this reserve. Letter to M.D. Alembert, p. 204 p. 0101. Italics added. But is there a difference between corruption in the form of supplementarity and supplementary corruption? Perhaps it is the concept of supplementarity itself that allows us to think these two interpretations of interpretation at the same time. From the first departure from nature, the play of history as supplementarity carries within itself the principle of its own degradation, of the supplementary degradation, of the degradation of degradation. The acceleration, the precipitation of perversion within history, is implied from the very start by the historical perversion itself. But the concept of the supplement, considered, as we have already done, as an economic concept, should allow us to say the contrary at the same time without contradiction. The logic of the supplement, which is not the logic of identity, allows the acceleration of evil to find at once its historical compensation and its historical guardrail. History precipitates history, society corrupts society, but the evil that links both in an infinity chain Kila Ablum J has its natural supplement as well. History and society produce their own resistance to the abyss L J. Thus, for example, the moral part of love is immoral, captor and destroyer. But just as one may guard presence through deferring it, just as one may defer the expense, put off the mortal cohabitation with woman by that other power of death which is autoeroticism, so also, according to this economy of life or death, society may place a moral guardrail over the abyss of moral love. The morality of society can in fact defer or weaken the capturing of energy by imposing on woman the virtue of modesty. Within modesty, that product of social refinement, it is in fact natural wisdom, the economy of life, that controls culture by culture. Rousseau's entire discourse, let us note in passing, finds here its proper field of exercise. As women betray the natural morality of physical desire, society invents but it is a ruse of nature the moral imperative of modesty which limits immorality, limits morality in fact, for moral love was never immoral except as it menaced man's life. The theme of modesty has a greater importance in the letter to M.D. Alembert than is generally thought. But it is central in Emile, especially in that fifth book which one must follow here line by line. Modesty is clearly defined there as a supplement of natural virtue. It has to do with knowing if men wish to allow themselves to be dragged to their death, p. 447 po 322, by the number and intemperance of women. Their boundless desire does not in fact have that sort of natural restraint that one encounters in female animals. With the latter, when the need is satisfied, the desire ceases, they no longer make a feint of repulsing the male, they do it in earnest. They do exactly the opposite of what Augustus' daughter did, they receive no more passengers when the ship has its cargo. Instinct both drives and stops them. But what would take the place of supplement this negative instinct in women if you rob them of their modesty? To wait for them not to concern themselves with men, is to wait for them to be good for nothing. Italics added. And this supplement is indeed the economy of men's lives, * their natural intemperance would lead them to death, because it contains their desires, modesty is the true morality of women. It is clearly confirmed that the concept of nature and the entire system it commands may not be thought except under the irreducible category of the supplement. Although modesty comes to fill the lack of a natural and instinctive restraint, it is, nonetheless, as a supplement, and moral as it certainly is, natural. This product of culture has an natural origin and a natural end. God himself has inscribed it in his creatures, the Most High has deigned to do honor to mankind, he has endowed man with boundless passions, together with the law to guide them, so that man may be alike free and self-controlled, though swayed by these passions man is endowed with reason by which to control them. Woman is also endowed with boundless passions, God has given her modesty to restrain them p. 32:3 Thus God gives reason to supplement natural inclinations. Reason is thus at once within nature and in a supplementary role to nature, it is a supplementary ration. Which supposes that nature might sometimes lack something within itself or, what he is the same thing, might sometimes exceed itself. And God even adds a bonus, premium, a recompense, a supplement to the supplement. Moreover, Rousseau continues, he has given to both a present reward for the right use of their powers, in the delight which springs from that right use of them, i.e., the taste for right conduct established as the law of our behavior. To my mind this is far higher than the instinct of the beasts po 32:3. Guided by this pattern, one would have to reread all the texts describing culture as the corruption of nature, in the sciences, the arts, spectacles, masks, literature, writing. One would have to take them up again within the network of the structure of moral love, as the war of the sexes and as the chaining of the force of desire by the feminine principle. Setting not only men against women but also men against men, this war is historic. It is not a natural or biological phenomenon. As in Hegel, it is a war of consciousness and desires, not of needs or natural desires. How does one identify it? In particular by what cannot be explained by the scarcity of females or by the exclusive intervals, during which the females constantly refuse the addresses of the male, which, Rousseau notes, amounts to the first cause, for if each female admits the male but during 2 months in the year, it is the same as if the number of females were 5/6 less. Now, neither of these two cases is applicable to the human species, in which the number of females usually exceeds that of males, and among whom it has never been observed, even among savages, that the females have, like those of other animals, their stated times of passion and indifference. Moral love, not having any biological foundation, is born of the power of the imagination. All the depravity of culture, as the movement of difference and preference, is therefore related to the possession of women. One must know who will have the women but also what the women will have. And what price will be paid within that calculation of forces. Now according to the principle of acceleration or of capitalization that we have just defined, what T opens evil is also that which precipitates toward the worst. Rousseau might say like Montaigne our morals bend with a marvelous inclination toward worsening, essays 2.s2. Asterisk thus writing, here literary, conspires with moral love. The first appears at the same time as the second. But moral love degrades even writing. It innovates writing as it innovates man. It provokes these throngs of ephemeral works which come to light every day, made only to amuse women and having neither strength nor depth, and which fly from the dressing table to the counter. This is the way to rewrite ever again the same things and to make them always new. 2 or 3 will be cited which will serve as exceptions, but I will cite 100,000 which will confirm the rule. It is for this reason that most of the productions of our age will pass with it, and posterity will think that very few books were written in this age which produced so many. 18 Has the Steeder taken us far from OUF initial preoccupation? How will it help us to situate the essay more precisely? We have just verified that, comprehended by the entire system of oppositions that it sustains, the concept of natural pity is fundamental. Yet, according to Stravinsky, it is absent, indeed excluded, from the essay on the origin of languages. And one cannot ignore this fact when assigning it a place within the history and architectonics of Rousseau's thought. The importance of the spontaneous outburst of pity, the unreasoned foundation of morality, has been indicated by Rousseau since the preface to the discourse, cfp. 126 and n. 1. In this part of the discourse, and later in Emile, Rousseau does not cease affirming that pity is a virtue that precedes the usage of all reflection. This is the definitive state of Rousseau's thought on this subject. Now the essay on the origin of languages, ch. 9, formulates on this point many quite different ideas, which will perhaps allow us to attribute to this text, or at least to this chapter, a date anterior to the final draft of the discourse on the origin of inequality. In the essay, Rousseau does not admit the possibility of an unpremeditated burst of sympathy, and seems more inclined to sustain the Hobbesian idea of the war of all against all. They were not bound by any idea of common brotherhood and, having no rule but that of force, they believed themselves each other's enemies. An individual isolated on the face of the earth, at the mercy of mankind, is bound to be a ferocious animal. We develop social feeling only as we become enlightened. Although pity is native to the human heart, it would remain eternally quiescent unless it were activated by imagination. How are we moved to pity? By getting outside ourselves and identifying with the being who suffers. We suffer only as much as we believe him to suffer. He who has never been reflective is incapable of being merciful or just or pitying. He is just as incapable of being malicious and vindictive pp 3132. This more intellectualist conception of pity agrees with the thought of Wollaston. Are these affirmations, extracted from the essay and quoted by Stravinsky, incompatible with the theses of the discourse and Emile? It seems not. At least for 3 sorts of reasons. A first, Rousseau makes a concession in the essay which assures its place within the entire theory supposedly later of pity. He writes, although pity is native to the human heart, he thus recognizes that pity is an innate, spontaneous, and pre-reflexive virtue. That will be the thesis of the discourse and of Emile. B. It is imagination, not reason, without which this pity natural to man's heart would remain unawakened and inactive. According to the second discourse, natural pity is in danger of being strangled or corrupted by reason and reflection. Reflective reason is not contemporaneous with pity. The essay does not say the contrary. Pity does not awaken with reason but with imagination, which wrenches it from its slumbering inactuality. Not only does Rousseau take for granted the distinction between imagination and reason, but he makes this difference the strength of his entire thought. Certainly imagination here has a value whose ambiguity is often recognized. If it is able to corrupt us, it is first because it opens the possibility of progress. It broaches history. Without it, perfectibility, which, as one knows, constitutes the absolute distinguishing trait of humanity for Rousseau, would be impossible. Although the concept of reason is very complex in Rousseau 19, it may be said that, in certain regards, reason, inasmuch as it is the understanding and the faculty of forming ideas, is less proper to humanity than imagination and perfectibility. We have already noticed in what sense reason may be called natural. One may also remark that from another point of view animals, although they are gifted with intelligence, are not perfectible. They are deprived of the imagination, of that power of anticipation that exceeds the givens of the senses and takes us toward the unperceived. Every animal has ideas. Since it has senses, it even combines those ideas in a certain degree, and it is only in degree that man differs, in this respect, from the brute. Some philosophers have even maintained that there is a greater difference between one man and another than between some men and some beasts. It is not, therefore, so much the understanding that constitutes the specific difference between the man and the brute, as the human quality of free agency. Second discourse, p. 141 p. 170, liberty is therefore perfectibility. There is another very specific quality which distinguishes the man and animal, and which will admit of no dispute. This is the faculty of self-improvement se perfectioner, p. 142, po 171. The imagination is at the same time the condition of perfectibility liberty, and that without which pity would neither awaken nor exercise itself within a human order. It activates and excites a potential power. 1. Imagination inaugurates liberty and perfectibility because sensibility, as well as intellectual reason, filled and satiated by the presence of the perceived, is exhausted by a fixed concept. Animality has no history because feeling and understanding are, at root, functions of passivity. As reason has little force, interest alone does not have as much force as one believes. Only imagination is active, and one excites the passions only by imagination. Letter to the Prince of Wurtemberg 1:10.63. Asterisk immediate consequence, reason, a function of interest and need, the technical and calculating faculty, is not the origin of language, which is also a human property and without which there would be no perfectibility. Language is born of the imagination, which arouses or at any rate excites sentiment or passion. This affirmation, which will be repeated ceaselessly, is already there at the opening of the essay. Speech distinguishes man among animals. The first words of chapter 2, it seems then that need dictated the first T gestures, while the passions rung forth the first words P011. We thus see two series working themselves out. 1. Animality, need, interest, gesture, sensibility, understanding, reason, etc. 2. Humanity, passion, imagination, speech, liberty, perfectibility, etc. It will gradually appear that, under the complexity of strands tangled in Russia US texts among these terms, requiring the minutest and most careful analyses, these two series always relate to each other according to the structure of supplementary writing. All the names of the second series are metaphysical determinations and therefore inherited, arranged with a laborious and interrelating coherence of supplementary difference. A dangerous difference, of course. For we have omitted the master name of the supplementary series, death. Or rather, for death is nothing, the relationship to death, the anguished anticipation of death. All the possibilities of the supplementary series, which have the relationships of metonymic substitutions among themselves, indirectly name the danger itself, the horizon and source of all determined dangers, the abyss from which all menaces announce themselves. We should not be surprised when, in the second discourse, the notion of perfectibility or liberty is set forth at the same time as the knowledge of death. The property of man is announced from the double possibility of liberty and of the express anticipation of death. The difference between human desire and animal need, between relationship with the woman and relationship with the female, is the fear of death. The only goods the animal recognizes in the universe are food, a female, and sleep. The only evils he fears are pain and hunger. I say pain, and not death, for no animal can know what it is to die, the knowledge of death and its terror being one of the first acquisitions made by man in departing from an animal state. Second discourse, p143 p0171, so does the child become man when he opens himself to the consciousness of death. Emile, p20, po15. If one moves along the course of the supplementary series, he sees that imagination belongs to the same chain of significations as the anticipation of death. Imagination is at bottom the relationship with death. The image is death. A proposition that one may define or make indefinite thus, the image is a death, or, the death is an image. Imagination is the power that allows life to affect itself with its own representation. The image cannot represent and add the representer to the represented, except in so far as the presence of the represented is already folded back upon itself in the world, in so far as life refers to itself as to its own lack, to its own wish for a supplement. The presence of the represented is constituted with the help of the addition to itself of that nothing which is the image, announcement of its dispossession within its own representer and within its death. The property le proper j of the subject is merely the movement of that representative expropriation. In that sense imagination, like death, is representative and supplementary. Let us not forget that these are the qualities Rousseau expressly recognizes in writing. Imagination, liberty, and speech belong then to the same structure as the relationship with death. Let us rather say relationship than anticipation. To suppose that there is a being faced with death is not necessarily to suppose that there is a relationship established with a more or less distant point on a horizon of time. It is a structure of presence. How do pity and the identification with others' suffering intervene there? 2. I have said that the imagination is the only thing which can excite natural pity. Rousseau says this clearly in the essay, but, contrary to what Starobinsky's most careful formulation would seem to imply, he also invariably says it elsewhere. For him, pity never stops being a natural sentiment or an inner virtue that only imagination has the power to awaken or reveal. Let us note in passing that Rousseau's entire theory of the theatre also establishes a connection, within representation, between the power of identification pity and the faculty of the imagination. If now it is remembered that Rousseau gives the name terror to the fear of death, discourse, p143, po171, one perceives together the entire system which organizes the concepts of terror and pity on the one hand, and of the tragic scene, representation, the imagination, and death on the other. This example makes the ambivalence of the power of imagining understandable. It surmounts animality and arouses human passion only by opening the scene and the space of theatrical representation. It inaugurates the perversion whose possibility is itself inscribed in the notion of perfectibility. The scheme upon which Rousseau's thought has never varied would therefore be the following: pity is innate, but in its natural purity it is not the property of man in particular, it belongs to all living beings in general. It is so natural, that the very brutes themselves sometimes give evident proofs of it. Po 182. Without imagination, this pity does not awaken of itself in humanity, is not accessible to passion, language, and representation, does not produce identification with the other as with another me. Imagination is the becoming human of pity. That is indeed the thesis of the essay. Although pity is native to the human heart, it would remain eternally quiescent unless it were activated by imagination. Po 32. This appeal to activation and to actualization by the imagination is so little in contradiction with other texts that one can follow everywhere in Rousseau's work a theory of innateness as virtuality or of naturality as sleeping potentiality. Point 20. Not a very original theory to be sure, but one whose organizing role is indispensable. It asks us to think of nature not as a given, as a real presence, but as a reserve. This concept is itself confusing. One may determine it as a hidden actuality, dissimulated deposit, but also as a reserve of indeterminate power. Such that the imagination, which makes the power of that reserve come forth, is at once beneficent and maleficent. In fact, such is the empire of the imagination among us, and such is its influence, that from it are born not only the virtues and the vices, but also good and evil. Dialogues, Pleiadi, pages 815-16. And if certain people pervert the usage of this consoling faculty, it is once more by the power of the imagination. Escaping all real and exterior influence, the imagination, faculty of signs and appearances, perverts itself. It is the subject of perversion. It awakens the potential faculty but just as quickly transgresses it. It brings forth the power which was held back but, by showing that power what lies beyond it, by superseding it, imagination signifies for it its powerlessness. It animates the faculty of enjoyment but inscribes a difference between desire and power. If we desire beyond our power of satisfaction, the origin of that surplus and of that difference is named imagination. This permits us to determine a function of the concept of nature or of primitiveness. It is the equilibrium between reserve and desire. An impossible equilibrium, for desire cannot awaken and move out of its reserve except by the imagination, which also breaks the equilibrium. This impossible thing, another name for nature, therefore remains a limit. According to Rousseau, ethics, human wisdom, the path of true happiness, consists, then, in staying as close as possible to that limit, and in decreasing the difference between our desires and our powers. 1 Exes de desires sur les facultés. In this condition, nature, who does everything for the best, has placed him from the first. To begin with, she gives him only such desires as are necessary for self-preservation and such powers as are sufficient for their satisfaction. All the rest she has stored in his mind as a sort of reserve, to be drawn upon at need. It is only in this primitive condition that we find the equilibrium between desire and power, and then alone man is not unhappy. As soon as his potential powers of mind begin to function, imagination, more powerful than all the rest, awakes, and precedes all the rest. It is imagination which enlarges the bounds of possibility for us, whether for good or ill, and therefore stimulates and feeds desires by the hope of satisfying them. But the object which seemed within our grasp flies quicker than we can follow. Thus we exhaust our strength, yet never reach our goal, and the nearer we are to pleasure, the further we are from happiness. On the other hand, the more nearly a man's condition approximates to the state of nature, the more the difference between his desires and his powers is small, and he is therefore less remote from happiness. The world of reality has its bounds, the world of imagination is boundless. As we cannot enlarge the one, let us restrict the other, for all the sufferings which really make us miserable arise from the difference between the real and the imaginary. Emile, p. 64 pp. 44-45. Italics added. Thus we note, 1. That imagination, origin of the difference between power and desire, is determined as difference, of or within presence or pleasure essence. 2. That the relationship to nature is defined in terms of negative distance. It is not a question of departing from nature, or of rejoining it, but of reducing its distance. 3. That imagination, which excites other virtual faculties, is nonetheless itself a virtual faculty, the most active of all. So much so that the power of transgressing nature is itself within nature. It belongs to nature's resources. Better, we shall see that the power of transgression holds the reserve in reserve. This being in nature has thus the strange mode of being of the supplement, designating at once the excess and lack of nature within nature. Here we shall locate the unsteadying of a classical logic through the signification of being within, as through one example among others. Inasmuch as it is the most active of all the faculties, imagination cannot be awakened by any faculty. When Rousseau says it awakens itself, he means it in a very strictly reflexive sense. Imagination alone has the power of giving birth to itself. It creates nothing because it is imagination. But it receives nothing that is alien or anterior to it. It is not affected by the real. It is pure auto-affection. It is the other name of difference as auto-affection. Rousseau delineates man out of this possibility. Imagination inscribes the animal within human society. It makes the animal accessible to humankind. The paragraph of the essay which we are considering ends thus: he who imagines nothing senses no one but himself, he is alone in the midst of humankind. This solitude or this non-belonging to humankind is due to the fact that suffering remains mute and closed in upon itself. Which signifies on the one hand that it cannot open itself, by the awakening of pity, to the suffering of the other as other, and on the other hand that it cannot exceed itself toward death. Indeed, the animal does have a potential faculty of pity, but it imagines neither the suffering of the other as such nor the passage from suffering to death. Indeed, that is one and the same limit. The relation with the other and the relation with death are one and the same opening. That which is lacking in what Rousseau calls the animal is the ability to live its suffering as the suffering of another and as the threat of death. Thought within its concealed relation to the logic of the supplement, the concept of virtuality or potentiality, like the entire problematic of power and the act, undoubtedly has for its function, for Rousseau in particular and within metaphysics in general, the systematic predetermining of becoming as production and development, evolution, or history, through the substitution of the accomplishment of a dynamis for the substitution of a trace, of pure history for pure play, and, as I noted above, of a welding together for a break. The movement of supplementarity seems to escape this alternative and to permit us to think it. See, Rousseau thus comes to evoke the awakening of pity by the imagination, that is to say by representation and reflection in the double but actually in the single sense of those words. In the same chapter, he forbids us to think that before the actualization of pity through imagination, man is wicked and bellicose. Let us recall Stravinsky's interpretation. In the essay, Rousseau does not admit the possibility of an unpremeditated burst of sympathy, and seems more inclined to sustain the Hobbesian idea of the war of all against all. They were not bound by an idea of common brotherhood and, having no rule but that of force, they believed themselves each other's enemies. An individual isolated on the face of the earth, at the mercy of mankind, is bound to be a ferocious animal. Essay, pp. 3132. Rousseau does not say they were each other's enemies but they believed themselves each other's enemies. It seems to be that we have the right to, and indeed should, consider that nuance. Primitive hostility comes out of a primitive illusion. This first opinion is due to a misguided belief, born of isolation, feebleness, dereliction. That it is only a simple opinion and already an illusion appears clearly in these three sentences. That must not be overlooked. They believed themselves each other's enemies. This belief was due to their weakness and ignorance. Knowing nothing, they feared everything. They attacked in self-defense. An individual isolated on the face of the earth. Essay, p32. Italics added. Ferocity is thus not bellicose but fearful. Above all, it is incapable of declaring war. It is the animal's characteristic, ferocious animal, the characteristic of the isolated being who, not having been awakened to pity by the imagination, does not yet participate in sociality or in humankind. That animal, let us emphasize, would be ready to do unto others all the evil that he feared from them. Fear and weakness are the sources of cruelty. Essay, p32. Italics added. Cruelty is not positive wickedness. The disposition to do evil finds its resource only in the other, in the illusory representation of evil that the other seems disposed to do to me. Is this not already sufficient reason for setting aside the resemblance with the Hobbesian theory of a natural war that imagination and reason would merely organize into a sort of economy of aggressivity? But Rousseau's text is even clearer. In the essay, the paragraph that occupies us comprises another proposition which forbids us to consider the moment of slumbering pity as the moment of bellicose wickedness, as a Hobbesian moment. How in fact does Rousseau describe that moment? Here at least it does not matter if it is real or mythic, the structural instance of slumbering pity. What, according to him, is that moment when language, imagination, relation to death, etc., are still reserved? At that moment, he says, he who has never been reflective is incapable of being merciful or just or pitying. Po 32. To be sure. But that is not to say that he would be unjust and pitiless. He is simply held short of that opposition of values. For Rousseau follows up immediately, he is just as incapable of being malicious and vindictive. He who imagines nothing is aware only of himself, he is isolated in the midst of mankind, Ibid. In that state, the oppositions available in Hobbes have neither sense nor value. The system of appreciation within which political philosophy moves, has as yet no chance to function. And one thus sees more clearly within what, neutral, naked, and bare, element that system enters into play. Here one may speak with indifference of goodness or badness, of peace or war, each time it will be as true as false, always irrelevant. What Rousseau thus reveals is the neutral origin of all ethico-political conceptuality, its field of objectivity, and its axiological system. All the oppositions that follow in the wake of the classical philosophy of history, culture, and society must therefore be neutralized. Before this neutralization, or this reduction, political philosophy proceeds within the naivete of acquired and accidental evidence. And it incessantly risks the blunder made by those who, in reasoning on the state of nature, always import into it ideas gathered in a state of society. Second Discourse, p. 146, po 174j. The reduction that the essay operates has a particular style. Rousseau neutralizes oppositions by erasing them, and he erases them by affirming contradictory values at the same time. The procedure is used with coherence and firmness, precisely in chapter 9, this accounts for the apparent contradiction seen in the fathers of nations, so natural, and so inhuman, such ferocious behavior and such tender hearts. These barbaric times were a golden age, not because men were united, but because they were separated. If you wish, men would attack each other when they met, but they rarely met. A state of war prevailed universally, and the entire earth was at peace. Po 33.22. To privilege one of the two terms, to believe that only a state of war actually existed, was the Hobbesian error that strangely redoubles the illusory opinion of the first men who believed they were enemies of each other. Again, no difference between essay and discourse. The reduction operating within the essay will be confirmed in the discourse, precisely in the course of a critique of Hobbes. What is reproached in Hobbes is precisely that he concludes too quickly that men were neither naturally awakened to pity, nor bound by any idea of common fraternity, that they were therefore wicked and bellicose. We cannot read the essay as Hobbes might have hastily interpreted it. We cannot conclude wickedness from non-goodness. The essay says it and the discourse confirms it. If we assume that the latter comes after the former, above all, let us not conclude, with Hobbes, that because man has no idea of goodness, he must be naturally wicked, that he is vicious because he does not know virtue. Hobbes did not reflect that the same cause, which prevents a savage from making use of his reason, as our jurists hold, prevents him also from abusing his faculties, as Hobbes himself allows, so that it may be justly said that savages are not bad merely because they do not know what it is to be good, for it is neither the development of the understanding nor the restraint of law that hinders them from doing ill, but the peacefulness of their passions, and their ignorance of vice. Tanto plus in illis proficit vidi aurum ignoratio, quam in his cognitio virtutis. 23. One knows also from other indications that the economy of pity does not vary from the essay to the great works. When pity is awakened itself by imagination and reflection, when sensible presence is exceeded by its image, we can imagine and judge that the other feels and suffers. Yet, we neither can nor should simply experience the suffering of others by itself. According to Rousseau, pity does not allow the movement of identification to be simple and entire. Apparently for two reasons, actually for a single profound reason. It is a question yet again of a certain economy. 1. We neither can nor should feel the pain of others immediately and absolutely, for such an interiorization or identification would be dangerous and destructive. That is why the imagination, the reflection, and the judgment that arouse pity also limit its power and hold the suffering of the other at a certain distance. One knows the suffering for what it is, one pities others, but one protects oneself, and holds the evil at arm's length. This doctrine, which could further be related to the theory of dramatic representation, is formulated in both the essay and Emile. The paradox of the relation to the other is clearly articulated in those two texts. The more you identify with the other, the better you feel his suffering as his. Our own suffering is that of the other. That of the other, as itself, must remain the other's. There is no authentic identification except in a certain non-identification, etc. The essay, how are we moved to pity? By getting outside ourselves and identifying with the being who suffers. We suffer only as much as we believe him to suffer. It is not in ourselves, but in him that we suffer. Po 32. Emile, he shares the suffering of his fellow creatures, but he shares it of his own free will and finds pleasure in it. He enjoys at once the pity he feels for their woes and the joy of being exempt from them. He feels in himself that state of vigor which projects us beyond ourselves, and bids us carry elsewhere the superfluous activity of our well-being. To pity another's woes we must indeed know them, but we need not feel them. P 270, P 190. We must therefore not let ourselves be destroyed by identification with others. The economy of pity and of morality must always let itself be contained within the limits of the love of self, all the more because it alone can illuminate the good of others for us. That is why the maxim of natural goodness, do to others as you would have them do unto you, should be tempered by this other maxim, much less perfect indeed, but perhaps more useful: do good to yourself with as little evil as possible to others. Second Discourse, p. 156, po 18.5j. The latter is put in place of the former. 2. Further, identification by interiorization would not be moral. A. It would not recognize suffering as the suffering of the other. Morality, respect for the other, therefore supposes a certain non-identification. This paradox of pity as relation to the other is presented by Rousseau also as the paradox of the imagination and of time, that is to say of comparison. This concept, so important in Rousseau's thought, is at the center of the essay's chapter 9 and it intervenes in the explication of pity. In the experience of suffering as the suffering of the other, the imagination, as it opens us to a certain non-presence within presence, is indispensable. The suffering of others is lived by comparison, as our non-present, past, or future suffering. Pity would be impossible outside of this structure, which links imagination, time, and the other as one and the same opening into non-presence. To pity another's woes we must indeed know them, but we need not feel them. When we have suffered, when we are in fear of suffering, we pity those who suffer, but when we suffer ourselves, we pity none but ourselves. Emile, p. 270, p. 0190. Just before this, Rousseau had explained this unity of pity and the experience of time in memory or anticipation, in imagination, and non-perception in general. The bodily effect of our sufferings is less than one would suppose. It is memory that prolongs the pain, imagination which projects it into the future, and makes us really to be pitied. This is, I think, one of the reasons why we are more callous to the sufferings of animals than of men, although a fellow feeling ought to make us identify ourselves equally with either. We scarcely pity the cart horse in his shed, for we do not suppose that while he is eating his hay he is thinking of the blows he has received and the labors in store for him. Emile, p. 264, p. 186b. Identification pure and simple would be immoral because it would remain empirical and would not be produced in the element of the concept of universality and formality. The condition of morality is dhat through the unique suffering of a unique being, through his presence and his empirical existence, humanity gives itself up to pity. As long as this condition is not fulfilled, pity risks becoming unjust. Imagination and temporality therefore open the reign of concept and law. One may say that already for Rousseau, the concept which he also calls comparison exists as time. It is for him, as Hegel will say Dasein. Pity is contemporary with speech and representation. To prevent pity degenerating into weakness we must generalize it and extend it to mankind. Then we only yield to it when it is in accordance with justice, since justice is of all the virtues that which contributes most to the common good. Reason and self-love compel us to love mankind even more than our neighbor, and to pity the wicked is to be very cruel to other men. On this point there is no development in Rousseau's thought. It seems to me that one cannot draw an internal argument out of this in order to conclude a precociousness or a philosophical anteriority for the essay. For the moment, the field of external hypotheses is thus opened, even if we reserve the possibility of raising other internal problems when the time comes.